19 animals nobody wanted. A yard full of men who already know how this ends.
She isn't looking at what they see. She's reading something the rest of the yard has already stopped believing in.
In a moment, one word from the wrong man will try to turn this into a joke the whole county repeats for years. He has never once passed up a chance to say what he believes. He is about to say it in front of everyone. The whole yard is waiting to hear what she says back.
The morning of the auction, there were 19 cattle nobody wanted. They stood in the far pen at the back of Breckman's Bimmel livestock yard, in the enclosure reserved for what the auctioneer politely called special cases and what everyone else called slaughter stock. The August sun had barely cleared the limestone ridgeline to the east, but already the yard smelled of dust and hide and the particular sourness of animals that had traveled too far on too little. The good buyers had come and gone with the early light, filling their wagons with the fat and the sound. What remained in that back pen was the discount, the leftover, the proof that some summers were harder than others and not everything survived them equally. 19 cattle off a foreclosed place in Mercer Flats, 2 counties west. The story had made its way to Brackett's Mill ahead of them, the way stories did in Irongrass County, traveling faster than the animals themselves, arriving already shaped into the form people preferred. A rancher who'd borrowed against 3 bad years finally ran out of years. The bank got the land. The cattle got what was left of the summer pasture, which was very little, and by the time the paperwork cleared and the animals were loaded and hauled east, there wasn't much left of them either. Their hip bones stood up under loose skin like tent poles under canvas gone slack. Their coats had gone the color of dried creek mud, dull and patchy, the kind of dull that made men look away not from pity, but from something closer to embarrassment, as though the animals had failed at something they should have managed on their own. One of them leaned against the rail because standing straight cost more than she had available to spend. Into that pen on a Tuesday in late August of 1883 walked a woman not yet 24 years old with a bidding number folded in her hand and no particular expression on her face. Her name was Vesper Holt. She had been back in Irongrass County for exactly 11 weeks. She stood at the rail and looked at those 19 cattle for a long time without saying anything, longer than seemed reasonable, long enough that the men leaning on the fence beside her began to notice. She wasn't looking at all of them at once. She moved her attention from animal to animal with the deliberateness of someone reading a document rather than surveying livestock. She watched how they stood. She watched which ones shifted their weight and which ones held still. She watched where their eyes went when a boot scraped on the packed dirt of the yard. Then she raised her number and bought all 19 of them for less than the price of a single sound heifer. Somebody laughed. It was Garrett Dunmore, who ran the largest cattle operation on the northern edge of the county and had never in his life passed up a chance to say what he thought when he was certain he was right, which was most of the time. He was 52 years old and built like a man who had spent those years outdoors, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had stopped being young so long ago the transition was forgotten. He looked at the cattle in the pen, and he looked at Vesper Holt. He said, loud enough to carry across the yard, that she just paid good money for 19 head of slaughter weight that wouldn't survive Texas, that the ground she was putting them on wouldn't feed a jackrabbit, and that the whole enterprise would be finished before the first hard freeze. Vesper looked at him for one flat second. I'll let you know how it goes. She said it without height, without challenge, without the slightest invitation to continue the conversation. Then she turned back to the paperwork. Dunmore watched her walk away. His foreman, Clem Rafferty, said something low that made 2 of the other men grin. Dunmore didn't grin. He watched the Holt woman and something moved behind his expression that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite curiosity. And he put it away and went back to his business because he had a great deal of business and she was not part of it. She loaded the cattle in 2 trips on a borrowed wagon because they wouldn't all fit at once. The man who lent her the wagon didn't say anything about the animals. He was careful about what he said to people who had just come back to a place after a loss, which Vesper respected. She drove the first load out to Holt Ridge in the late morning and came back for the rest in the early afternoon. And by the time the sun was dropping toward the limestone hills, she had all 19 animals in the Upper Pasture farm that the county had mostly decided wasn't worth the trouble it represented. She stood at the fence in the last of the August light and watched them put their heads down into grass that stood belly high, rank with the volunteer forage and deep-rooted diversity that comes only when a pasture has been left entirely alone for a long time. The fields of Holt Ridge had been ungrazed for nearly 2 years. Since Ruth Holt's health had made the work impossible, since the old woman had spent her last winters in the house rather than the pastures, since management had given way to survival, and then survival had given way to spring without her. The grass that had grown up in those 2 years was not the thin monoculture of an overgrazed field. It was something older and denser, a complicated community of species that had reasserted itself the moment the pressure came off, and its nutritional density was something Vesper had noted in her own new notebook. On the very first morning she walked those fields, 2 days after the funeral, she watched the cattle eat and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Below it, she wrote 19 head. She did not write names. She had been told not to name what she might have to sell, and she intended to become practical about this, and she held to it for nearly a week before the naming became inevitable for one of them. The red-brown cow with the irregular white mark on her left hip. The one who had walked directly toward Vesper at the pen in the stockyard, who had been the first to step without hesitation onto the wagon, who stood now at the front of the group, with her head down and her whole attention. She had a name in Vesper's mind before the end of the first week. Compass. She wrote it in the notebook on the 8th day and made no note of the concession. Irongrass County, Texas, in the summer of 1883, was the kind of place that had existed long enough to have opinions about itself. The cattle trade ran through it like a second river, invisible but constant, determining which families prospered and which ones sold out and moved on. The limestone hills and cedar-choked draws of the western portions gave way in the east to better bottomland, and the men who owned that bottomland tended to own most of the other things worth owning as well. Garrett Dunmore owned 3,200 acres of it. He sat on the county commissioner's court. He had credit at First Irongrass Bank that other men spoke of with the reverence usually reserved for natural phenomena. The town of Brackett's Mill sat at the center of the county's commerce, a main street of wooden storefronts, a courthouse with a flagpole that caught the wind, a livestock yard on the eastern edge that smelled of the county's primary industry on days when the breeze came from that direction. There was no railroad yet. Everything came and went by wagon, distances measured in days and half-days, news traveling at the pace of a horse. In that world, a woman managing a 400-acre spread alone was not impossible. There were a handful of widows in the county who ran operations of one kind or another, and they were generally respected in the particular way that competence earns respect from people who would have preferred incompetence. But Vesper Holt was not a widow. She was a young woman who had come back from Austin with a remark on her face that nobody quite read, and she had bought 19 cattle that Garrett Dunmore had publicly called worthless, and the county was watching in the particular way counties watch when they expect to be proven right. She had not come back because she had a plan. Ruth Holt had died in April, quietly in the house she had lived in for 40 years, and there had been no one else. Vesper had been in Austin for 3 years, working as a bookkeeper for a freight company. Steady work, clean work, the kind of work that paid the rent, nothing left enough for small savings, and nothing beyond that. The city was large enough that she could go days without speaking to anyone who knew her name. She had thought, when she left Irongrass County at 20, that this was what she wanted, the anonymity, this distance from a place that had always had more opinions about her than she'd invited. What she had not anticipated was that distance had a weight to it that only increased with time, and that the life she was building in Austin had the quality of a house consisted entirely of things that would do. Furniture that was functional, friendships that were manageable, days that passed without insult and without particular meaning. She was not unhappy. She was something worse than unhappy. She was approximate. The telegram about Ruth came on a Wednesday in April, and by Saturday she was in a wagon heading south out of Austin with a trunk of clothes and a certificate in practical agriculture she had earned at 19 from a woman who ran an agricultural training program out of her farm in Hill County. A woman who had taught 4 other women the same things and never charged what the knowledge was worth. The old horse named Biscuit had been left to Vesper specifically in Ruth's will. Her grandmother had known she would need something that was already hers when she arrived. Holt Ridge sat at the end of a red dirt road in a fold of the limestone hills, 400 acres, 80 of which could be called improved by any standard, the rest being cedar draws and rocky outcrops and steep-sided gullies, where nothing much grew but scrub and the memory of harder working generations. The house was old and square and stood level to the horizon in a way that suggested it had decided to stay a long time ago and had been proved right. The barn leaned slightly east, the way the barns did in that part of the county, all of them slowly tilting toward the same prevailing wind like old men in conversation. Ruth had kept cattle on that place her whole long life. Never many, never fat, but always some, always managed with the kind of attention that her neighbors acknowledged without understanding. When Vesper was small, she had spent summers here, trailing behind her grandmother through the pastures, while the old woman said almost nothing, and indicated things with a lifted chin or a pointed finger, and Vesper had absorbed a great deal in those silences, without knowing she was absorbing anything at all. She had not thought about any of it in years. Standing in the empty kitchen the week after the funeral, looking out a window at the overgrown fields and the broken fence line and the barn roof that had developed a soft spot over the east corner, she felt something in her chest settle instead of scatter. She was not going to sell. She could not have explained why, not in terms that would have satisfied a reasonable person. She only knew that when she looked out at that neglected ground, where her neighbors and the bank and everyone with an opinion would have seen a burden, a liability, a problem to be liquidated, she felt the particular quiet of a place waiting to be understood. The first thing she did before she bought a single animal or repaired a single fence was read. In the room off the kitchen that had been her grandfather's. August Holt, dead 30 years. A man she knew only as a name, and a faded photograph in which he stood squinting into the light with the expression of someone interrupted in the middle of thinking something through. There was a roll-top desk crammed with the accumulated paper of a working life. Alongside the tax receipts and seed invoices and the photographs of people no one living could identify, she flipped the notebooks. There were dozens of them, small and cloth-bound, spanning more than 2 decades. The handwriting was small and upright and consistent, the hand of a man who had learned to write carefully and kept at it. He recorded the daily weather and the state of the grass and the movement of the herd from field to field. He noted which cows held their weight through dry spells and which ones dropped. He wrote down the dates of every birth and every loss with the same flat precision, and interspersed among these records were stretches of observation that read less like a working log than like the field notes of someone studying a thing he loved. Vesper sat on the cold floor of that room and read for 3 days. Most of it she did not understand at first reading. The technical observations required a kind of cross-referencing. This pasture in this season against that pasture in a drought year. This cow's production, making her mother's and her mother's brothers, that revealed itself slowly, as a pattern emerging from what had first appeared to be random notation. But one phrase ran through the later notebooks, like a seam of different stone through limestone, appearing again in the margins, beside his notes about which fields performed when the rains failed, which springs held water when others went to mud and then to nothing. The ground remembers. She copied it into the front of her own new notebook without yet knowing what it meant, because she had begun, without quite deciding to keep one. Near the back of the last notebook, on a page dated the summer before his death in 1853, a single line stood apart from the entries around it, underlined once with the corporeal pressure of a man who wanted to be sure it held. The thin ones off the poor ground are the ones worth having if you know how to read them.
Tell Ruth.
Ruth was dead. The message had traveled 30 years through paper and found her granddaughter instead, and Aber copied that line into her notebook below the other one and put both books in the pocket of her coat. There was one person left in Irongrass County who might explain what August Holt had meant, and that was his sister-in-law, Prue Vance. Ruth's older sister, 91 years old, living alone in a small house at the edge of Brackett's Mill. In her time, the people who remembered that time said, Prue had understood cattle as well as Ruth had, and perhaps better, though she had left the work behind when her husband died and she moved to town, and she had not spoken much about it since. She wore men's work clothes because they lasted, and because she had lived long enough to stop caring what the decision communicated. She regarded the world with an economy of expression that could be mistaken for coldness by people who didn't understand the difference between coldness and precision. Esther went to see her the week after finding the notebooks. She brought the last one. She set it open on the kitchen table between them, the underlined line facing out. Prue looked at the page for a long time without speaking, the way a person looks at something they've been waiting to see again. And she said that August had spent his life proving something nobody wanted to believe. A cow that had stayed alive on bad ground was telling the truth about herself, and the truth was worth more than fat. Fat you could put on any animal with enough grain and enough money. What you could not buy was an animal whose body had already done the sorting, that could turn poor grass into flesh, that didn't fall apart the first hard year. Those were the ones worth having. She closed the notebook and slid it back across the table. August had built the foundation of his herd out of the discount pens, she continued. The culls and the rejects and the ones that came in too thin, because that was where the tough ones ended up when they arrived off ground that had already killed everything soft. He'd done it for 20 years, and his ground had gotten better every year while his neighbor's ground got worse. And they laughed at him right up until the drought of 1867 when his pastures held green and theirs turned to powder. By then he'd been dead 14 years and wasn't there to see it proved. Ruth held it for a while, Prue said. The last year she couldn't. She looked at Vesper for a long moment, a measuring look that didn't carry judgment so much as assessment, the look of a woman taking the measure of something she'd been wondering about. If you're going to the sale, watch for the one standing in the middle of the pen. Not the corners. The ones in the corners have already decided something's over. The ones in the middle are still paying attention to the world. That was the extent of the guidance. Vesper understood it to be sufficient. She went to the livestock yard at Brackett's Mill and stood at the rail of the back pen and did what Prue Vance had told her. She watched not the overall condition of the animals, but the character of it. She looked for the ones whose hip bones were wide and deep despite the lost flesh. The underlying architecture of cattle built for production, temporarily diminished but structurally intact. She looked for clear eyes, for ears that tracked sound, for the specific quality of alertness that distinguished an animal conserving energy from one that had simply stopped expecting things to improve. She found 19 of them. She bought all 19 while Garrett Dunmore laughed, and Clem Rafferty made a joke she didn't bother to hear completely. She said what she said, she'd let him know how it went, and she loaded her cattle in 2 trips and brought them home to the rank, ungrazed, 2-year recovered pastures of Holt Ridge. She noted in her first pasture entry that the nutritional density of the standing forage was likely exceptional precisely because of its extended rest, and that the cattle's recovery rate should be expected to exceed what any standard calculation would project. She was not guessing. She was reading what the field had to say about itself, the same way she'd read August's notebooks, looking for the pattern beneath the surface, the structure that persisted when everything else was stripped away. The work of that first autumn was slow and unglamorous and almost entirely invisible to anyone who wasn't in the pastures watching it happen. Vesper walked the fences and repaired them one at a time, driving staples and splicing wire, and setting new posts by hand in the order August's notebook suggested, beginning with the fields he had marked as recovering fastest after dry years, because those were where the good grass most wanted to return. She did not overgraze. This was the principle she had extracted most carefully from the notebooks, the one August turned to in different forms across 2 decades of records. Never strip a pasture to the ground. Pull the cattle off while green was still standing. Let the field rest until it had replaced what it gave. The roots that survived were deeper than the ones that didn't, and the soil that fed those roots was built up rather than exhausted, and the water that soaked in rather than running off was stored rather than lost. And all of this compounded quietly in the dark below the surface where no one could see it, and therefore no one bothered to argue about it. She moved the herd from field to field on a rotation she worked out from the notebooks, adjusting for what she saw in front of her rather than adhering rigidly to any schedule August had used, because she understood that he had been responding to conditions, not following a formula. The pastures she rested came back thicker than the season before. By October, the differences were already visible. The 19 bony animals that had come off the Mercer Flats foreclosure were changing. Slowly, on nothing but grass and clean water and rest, and the reputation that Vesper recorded in her notebook to the day, their coats were coming in. The tent-pole hips were softening under a covering of good flesh, laid on by the deep, diverse forage of a field that had been given 2 years to remember what it was. Compass, the red-brown cow with the white splash on her hip, had been the first one eating that August evening. She was the first one at the gate at every field change now, leading the others with a confidence that seemed innate rather than learned. The kind of certainty that comes from an animal that has decided the person on the other side of the gate is worth following. In town, the men at Aldridge General and Feed noticed Vesper the way they noticed anything that didn't fit the expected pattern. She came in every 2 weeks for salt and wire and the few things she couldn't produce, and the same group of established cattlemen gathered around the counter to trade prices and complaints, and the slow, reliable gossip that moved through the county like a second weather system. They went quiet when she came in, the particular quiet of men who have been talking about you and must recalibrate when you enter the room. Silas Aldridge, who owned the store and had known 3 generations of Holts, watched these exchanges from behind the counter with the expression of a man who has seen enough versions of the same situation to know how they tend to resolve. He was 61, lean, with the careful movements of someone who had spent a lifetime around things that could go wrong if handled carelessly. He rarely offered opinions that hadn't been requested. He had an excellent memory and the discipline not to display it unnecessarily. Clem Rafferty was the one who asked, with the false warmth of a man who thought cruelty was funnier when it wore a smile. "How are those rabbits getting along out there, Ms. Holt?" The other men grinned. It was a reference to Dunmore's remark at the sale that the land wouldn't feed a jack-rabbit, which had made its way into county circulation in the weeks since and grown slightly with each telling the way small cruelties do when they find a receptive audience. Vesper bought what she came for. When Rafferty asked whether she'd had to bury any of them yet, she said, "Not yet," in a tone so entirely free of the defensiveness he had been angling for that the joke had nowhere to go. Rafferty looked at the other men. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. Silas rang her purchases through without comment, but as she gathered her things to leave, he spoke quietly, almost as though completing a thought he'd been having before she arrived. "Your grandfather used to buy that kind of stock." A brief pause. People laughed at him too. He did not elaborate. He went back to the ledger on the counter as though he had not said anything in particular. Vesper walked out to her wagon and sat for a moment before she flicked the reins. That evening she wrote the words in her notebook, not because she needed to remember them, but because she was learning that small confirmations had weight, and weight should be recorded. It was the first time anyone in Irongrass County had spoken August Holt's name to her, as though it carried meaning beyond the deed to a piece of land. She went back to see Prue Vance once more before winter, not for more instruction, but for something she couldn't quite name. Confirmation, perhaps, or simply the company of someone who understood the long view. Prue made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Vesper told her what the fields looked like, and what the cattle looked like, and what she had found in the rest of August's notebooks beyond the one she'd brought the first time. Prue listened. She asked 2 specific questions about which pastures Vesper had rested and in what order, and when Vesper answered, she nodded once, briefly, the nod of someone checking a calculation and finding it correct. He would have done it the same way, she said, not a compliment. A statement of fact offered the way Prue offered most things, directly without decoration. She asked whether Vesper found the entry about the spring in the deep draw on the west side. Vesper said she had. August had written that the spring had never gone dry in his lifetime, fed by underground recharge from the ground above it. Ground that held its water because it had never been stripped to the root. That spring is the reason your grandmother stayed when everyone else thought the place wasn't worth keeping, Prue said. Ruth used to say the ranch would survive anything as long as that water ran. August had said the water ran because of what they did with the grass above it. Ruth said it ran because God was partial to stubborn women. She set her coffee cup down. I always thought they were both right. Vesper drove home in the November dusk and went out to break the first ice on the water troughs, and that cattle came to drink, and she counted them in the failing light the way she'd counted them every morning and every evening, a habit she had started the first week and intended to continue without interruption. 19. All present, all sound. The winter came down hard. It came the way the old-timers said it came every 3 or 4 years in those hills. A stretch of days in January when the temperature never rose above single digits, and the wind off the limestone ridges had an intention to it, a pressure and a persistence that felt personal. This was the season that killed cattle, and it was the season the county had been waiting for. The season that Garrett Dunmore had said would settle the question. He said it at the counter of Aldred General, and to anyone who stood still long enough, that the whole experiment would be resolved by the March thaw, that there would be a count of losses on Holt Ridge come spring that would clarify things considerably. The men who heard it agreed in the way men agree when agreement costs nothing, and being wrong later costs equally little. The prediction circulated through Brackett's Mill with the triple certainty and true. Vesper had read the notebooks. The notebooks were full of winters. August had written again and again, in different seasons and different kinds of cold, that cattle bred and grown on hard ground wintered easiest because their bodies had never learned to depend on ease. They did not have the comfort-bred fragility of stock raised on purchased feed and supplemented through every difficulty. They had metabolisms shaped by scarcity, immune systems tested by exposure, constitutions formed by the specific demands of the land that made them. She fed hay from the barn, her own hay from her own rested fields, in the shelter draws where the rock walls cut the wind. She went out every morning before full light to break the ice on the water and count heads and watch the cattle for anything that required attention. She watched the way you watch something you cannot afford to misread, with the whole of your attention and none of your assumptions. Every morning, 19. The killing cold of January passed into the grudging cold of February. February gave way to a March that felt like winter wearing a different coat. Still hard, still testing, offering false hints of warmth that retreated before they could establish themselves. When the thaw finally came and the grass began to show green in the low field at the beginning of April, Vesper opened the gate to the south pasture, and her 19 cattle walked out of the winter into the spring sounds whole and visibly carrying more condition than any reasonable expectation for animals in their history would have suggested. Not one had been lost, every single one. She stood at the gate and watched them move out into the new grass, compass leading as she always led, and wrote in her notebook, April 1884, all 19, winter losses, 0. She did not go to town to announce it. She was not built for announcements, and she understood that the county's opinion was a fixed thing that would not shift because she said something had occurred. It would shift slowly, the way everything true shifted in that community, because the fact of it could not be ignored indefinitely. Facts of a certain kind did not require advocacy. They required only time. She had also, the previous autumn, made a decision based on a single line in August's notebooks. His observation that the mistake other men made was not with their cattle but with their thinking, that they waited for an animal to prove herself before they invested in her, and so never gave the best animals the conditions that would let them show what they were. She had arranged in late September to bring in a bull on loan from Emmett Slade, a struggling rancher 4 miles south, whose place sat on land that had been grazed too hard for too long, a man who had one good crossbred bull and not much else working in his favor. Vesper had watched each cow through the breeding period and recorded what she observed. She identified 5 with clear signs of having caught. 4 others she was uncertain about. She noted all of this without making predictions she wasn't prepared to revise. The calves began arriving in late March, carried to term through the winter she'd been told would kill the mothers. The first one came in the pre-dawn dark on a morning when the frost was still hard on the grass, and Vesper was there for it, had been there for most of the night. The calf stood within the hour, wet and translucent-eared and entirely certain of itself. The cow turned and began the cleaning without any assistance, with the matter-of-fact competence of an animal that has never been given reason to expect help, and has made her peace with that. 7 more followed over the next 3 weeks. The 4 she had been uncertain about had caught. One she counted as likely had not. An older cow whose hip structure had shown signs of difficulty that Vesper hadn't fully recognized until the 2nd month, and whom she'd moved to as once she understood. Because asking more of an animal than it could give without damage was the same mistake at a smaller scale as asking more of a pasture than it could give without damage. The mathematics worked out to 9 calves from the remaining cows. Not a single one required pulling. Everyone stood and nursed within the first hour. Not one was lost. She sat on the rail of the lower fence in the thin spring light and watched them find their legs in the wet green of the pasture and wrote in her notebook, 9 calves, 0 losses, spring 1884. She closed the book. She sat on the fence longer than the entry had required, watching a fact she had worked toward for 8 months stand in a field in front of her and be undeniably itself. What she had done in less than a year, on ground everyone said couldn't sustain it, with animals everyone said weren't worth the effort, was take 19 cattle that cost less than a single good breeding heifer and winter them without a loss and produce 9 sound calves without spending more than she had. She had done it by reading the land before she stocked it, and by listening to what the cattle told her about themselves, and by refusing to ask more of any pasture than it could give without damage. There was nothing miraculous about it. That was the point August had been making for 20 years in those notebooks, and that was the point nobody had been willing to believe. The calves stood in the field in front of her and nursed their mothers. She watched them and let the fact of them be what it was. The fact made its way into Brackett's mill through the same invisible network that everything made its way through. The feed store, the churchyard, the post office window. By June, it was generally known that the Holt woman's slaughter stock had come through winter without losses and had thrown 9 live calves and had not lost one. This was received with the kind of silence that in Irongrass County was the loudest available response. The silence of men who had made a public determination and were now confronted with evidence that didn't match it, who were not yet ready to revise their position but could no longer prosecute it with the same ease. Clem Rafferty stopped asking about the rabbits. He didn't announce this change. He simply found that the joke had become difficult to make with the conviction it required, and without conviction it was only a statement, and statements without conviction have no point. Silas Aldridge, at the end of a transaction in early June, looked at Vesper over the top of his spectacles for a moment. Then he said that he had some customers who had been asking whether she'd be selling this year, and that if she had any to spare, she should name her price and he would not argue with it. She thought about this on the drive home. She thought about the entry she'd found in the 6th notebook, a single paragraph in which August wrote about a restaurant 3 county east that had once bought everything he could supply, run by a man who understood the difference between commodity beef and something raised entirely another way. The arrangement had lasted until the man retired and was never replaced, and August had written about its ending with the specific grief of someone who had lost not just a customer, but a person who understood what they were doing and why. She thought about what she had eaten the previous evening. A steak from the first of the spring steers she'd had processed at a small butcher in the next town over, a steer raised entirely on the grass of Holt Ridge through 2 full seasons, never fed grain, never pushed. She had cooked it on the wood stove that ran hot and eaten it alone at the kitchen table and understood immediately that it was not the same thing as the beef at the general store. It had a depth and a particularity she did not have a ready word for. The taste of an animal that had eaten nothing but diverse, deep-rooted, rested hill pasture forage its whole slow life, and whose flesh carried that history the way good soil carries its own history in its smell and its color, and the way it holds together when you press it. She had written one word in the notebook that night. She had underlined it with the same deliberate pressure August used when he meant something to stay. Different. When she told Silas she had some to spare, she gave him a price that was higher than anything Brackett's mill was used to paying for beef. He looked at the number for a moment. Then he paid her from the drawer without discussion, cash, and told her he'd be in touch. A week later, his wagon came up the red dirt road to Holt Ridge. No one had driven out to see the place since she'd bought the cattle, and Dunmore had made his prediction, because there was an assumption in the county that you didn't drive out to watch someone fail, you waited for the news of it to come to you. Silas Aldridge came out on a September evening and walked the fields with Vesper in the low golden light, his coat buttoned against the first real autumn chill, saying almost nothing. At the far end of the pasture that had rested longest, the southwest field, ungrazed for the entire year, the ground built up with 2 seasons of root growth and decomposition, he stopped. He used the toe of his boot to break the crust of the surface. Then he did something Vesper had not seen him do. He lowered himself slowly to one knee, pressed his fingers into the open soil, and brought up a handful of it. It was black and loose and threaded through with roots, rich with the particular smell of ground that is building itself rather than losing itself. He held it in his open palm and looked at it for a long time. The way you look at something that matches a memory you'd begun to doubt was real. When he spoke, his voice had a quality it didn't have in the store. 40 years I've watched this county farm itself to death. 40 years and I haven't seen dirt like this outside the bottomland. He turned the soil slowly in his palm. Your grandfather used to bring me handfuls just like this, hold them out just like this, and tell me the ground remembered how to be good ground if you'd only stop punishing it and give it time. The ground remembers. August's phrase. Not in a notebook, not in a margin, not in a dead man's careful upright handwriting on paper that had yellowed at the edges, spoken aloud here in the September evening by a man who had heard it from the source 30 years before. Vesper felt something turn over in her chest that she did not have an immediate word for. It was not quite grief and not quite relief. It was the particular feeling of a thing that has been true for a long time being recognized at last. Silas closed his hand around the soil and let it fall back to where it had come from. He stood up with the careful effort of a man who has learned to respect the limitations of old knees. The beef you brought me is the best I've eaten since your grandfather stopped selling it. My wife said the same. He looked at her. People are going to ask where I got it. Do you mind if I tell them? She said she didn't mind. She said it in the same flat tone she used for everything, and she did not yet understand that in giving that one quiet permission, she had set the whole of the next thing into motion. Silas told people the way a good storekeeper tells things. Not with fanfare, not with a sign on the door, but in the course of conversation, mentioned to the right person at the right moment, passed along the same invisible channels that had carried the story of our 19 cattle and the winter they shouldn't have survived. He said, when it came up that if someone wanted real beef, the kind their grandparents remembered, the kind that tasted like something specific rather than something generic, the Holt woman out on the Ridge Road had it, raised on grass the old way. Better than anything at the store? Worth the price. Those people told others. By October, Vesper had a short list of names in the back of her notebook. People who had taken a box of wrapped cuts and wanted another. A woman from the First Methodist congregation who ran a boarding house and wanted to establish a regular order. A rancher from the south end of the county who had heard from his wife's cousin. She sold every cut from the 3 steers she'd processed and had requests she couldn't fill. She raised her price. Nobody left the list. She wrote down the total return from 3 animals she had bred from stock she bought for less than a single replacement heifer and looked at the number for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and went out to check the water troughs because the temperature was dropping again and there was ice starting to form at the edges. And the work did not stop because the numbers had gotten good. The cattle were there, 19 of them, plus the 9 calves now large enough to be counted separately in the fall tally, standing in the last of the October light on ground that had been called ago by the most credible voice in Irongrass County. Compass was at the front, as she always was, her coat thick and glossy. She watched Vesper come through the gate with the same attentive steadiness she'd shown at the stockyard pen. The look of an animal that has assessed a person, made a decision, and seen no reason since to revise it. The second winter announced itself in October with a week of hard north wind that stripped the last leaves off the post and left the ridgeline bare against a sky the color of cold iron. Vesper had learned enough from the first winter to read the signs and enough from August's notebooks to know what to do with what she read. She pulled the herd off the north pasture 2 weeks earlier than she might have otherwise, let that field stand through the cold months undisturbed, moved the cattle to sheltered draws where the limestone walls broke the wind, and the hay she'd put up from the rested summer. Fields waited in quantities that had surprised her when she finished stacking it. The calves from the spring were growing into something the county wouldn't have recognized as descended from the animals at the Mercer Flats foreclosure. They were not remarkable to look at. They would not have won anything at a county fair, but they were sound and they were growing and they were doing it on grass alone, which was the only measure that interested Vesper. Because grass alone was what they would have in the years when the money ran thin, and the years when the money ran thin were the years that determined what operation actually was beneath its good weather appearance. She had also that autumn made a quiet arrangement with Emmett Slade that went unannounced in either direction. She had 2 bred heifers she'd been considering keeping and had decided on reflection to sell. The reasons she'd been considering keeping them were sentimental, which she recognized as insufficient grounds for a business decision. She offered them to Emmett at a price he could manage, payable when he had it, without interest. He started to say something about the terms, and she told him she wasn't running a bank and didn't need to be paid like one. He looked at the fence she'd been mending rather than at her when she said it, which was the look of a man absorbing a kindness without knowing how to hold it. The arrangement was not mentioned to anyone. She wrote it in the notebook, 2 heifers for Slade, terms noted. That was sufficient. What August had written in the 11th notebook, that generosity in a working community was not sentiment but infrastructure, that the people who understood what you were doing and were given a stake in it became, over time, the network through which the work survived. She had read that passage twice and filed it in the part of her mind she kept for things that would prove themselves in the longer run. The second winter was harder than the first. 2 weeks in January brought temperatures the oldest men in Brackett's Mill said they hadn't seen in 40 years. Cold enough the springs and the draws frosted over. Cold enough that she added a second daily check of the water sources. The county lost cattle. Word came in through the feed store and the church. A rancher on the north end lost 11 head in a single week. Animals that had gone into winter in thin condition on overgrazed ground and hadn't had enough in reserve to absorb the extended cold. Another operation south of town lost calves. The numbers accumulated through January and February like a quiet accounting of the cost of methods that nobody had yet been forced to examine. On Holt Ridge, the cattle stood in the sheltered draws and ate their hay and drank the water. Vesper broke ice to provide them every morning before the light was fully up. They came through January whole. They came through February whole. In the first week of March, when the cold on the broke its grip and the temperature climbed above freezing for 3 days running, she walked the files and counted heads and checked legs and looked into eyes, every one of them. She did not write it with any particular emphasis. The notebook received the count and the date and the condition notes in the same format as every other entry, because to mark it differently would have been to treat it as exceptional, and she was working toward a future in which it was not exceptional at all, in which it was simply the expected result of doing things correctly. Spring 1885 came later than the previous spring, the grass in the low field not showing full green until mid-April. When it did, the cattle were already restless at the gate, and she turned them out into the south pasture on a morning when the sky had the particular blue that appears only at the end of a long winter. A color that seems to have a depth rather than surface. She watched them move through the gate and into the spring grass, compass at the front as always, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief but contained elements of both. The specific feeling of a thing you've built, holding up under the weight you always knew it would have to carry. The new spring calves, the second generation, born to mothers that had themselves been born and raised on the specific character of Holt Ridge grass, arrived in the first 2 weeks of April. 10 of them, from a herd that had grown through the winter to include several of the better yearling heifers she'd decided to keep. The count was changing shape, the arithmetic of a breeding herd beginning to compound in ways that rewarded patience in geometric rather than linear terms. She had more beef than she could sell through Silas Aldridge's quiet network. This was a new problem, and she considered it the way she considered all problems, by reading what the notebooks had to say about analogous situations before she decided what she thought herself. August had written, in the 14th notebook, about the difference between raising cattle for the commodity market, where the measure was weight and grade, and you were competing by volume against operations 10 times your size, and raising cattle to sell directly to people who understood that the product was different. He had observed that the second option required fewer animals and generated more return and put the rancher in a position of supplying something that couldn't be found elsewhere. He had written, "The cattle determine the price when what you've raised cannot be replicated by what money buys." She carried that line with her for several days before she acted on it. The acting on it was an adjustment to her prices upward and a decision to limit the supply rather than expand production to meet demand. The land would set the pace would set the supply. The scarcity of the supply would maintain the price. The price would finance the patience the whole system required. It would look, to most observers, like leaving money on the table, but most observers were not reading the right notebooks. Tobias Marsh came to the ranch for the first time on a Saturday in May. He was 16, and the son of a sharecropper family that worked a small piece of bottomland on the east side of the county, and he arrived on foot because the distance from his family's place to Holt Ridge was manageable if you didn't mind the walk, and he evidently didn't. He stood at the gate and waited, which was the correct thing to do, And when Vesper came out from the barn, he said he'd been hearing about the operation, and he was wondering if there was work and that he was a good worker and would prove it if she'd give him the chance. He said it in a way that suggested he'd decided against ornamentation. She looked at him. He was tall for 16 and thin, in the way of people who haven't yet caught up with their height, with the serious face of someone who'd had to learn early that being taken seriously required effort. She said she'd pay him for a full day's work on Saturdays if he showed up when he said he would and did what she asked without requiring explanation. She said this not unkindly but precisely, because imprecision about expectations created problems that precision avoided. He showed up the following Saturday before she'd finished the morning count, and she put him to work moving fence stakes in the east field. She watched how he went about it without appearing to watch. He didn't hurry. He didn't slow down when she was looking elsewhere. When he reached a section where the ground was too rocky for the stakes to go in straight, he stopped and considered the problem and solved it without coming to her to ask what to do, which was the best possible indicator of how he thought. He came back every Saturday through May and June. She began explaining things as they worked, the rotation schedule, the reasons for it, what she was watching for in each pasture when she walked it. He listened with the specific quality of attention of someone who is actually processing, rather than waiting for the talking to stop, and he asked questions that indicated he had been thinking about what she said in the interval before asking. In July, she showed him how to read a pasture for the indicator August had written about, the species composition, the root depth, the way the soil felt at different stages of the rotation. She pressed her fingers into the ground of a pasture that had rested 60 days and then into one that had rested 12 days and asked him what he noticed. He crouched down and looked at both carefully and identified 3 differences before she offered any. She noted this in the margin of that evening's entry, without elaborating. The summer of 1885 was dry, but not disastrously so. The kind of summer that tested everything moderately, that revealed structural weaknesses without creating catastrophe. Vesper watched the county's operations show their strain. Fields that had been grazed too hard through the spring showed bare patches by July. Cattle that had been pushed for production showed it in their summer condition. None of this was catastrophe. It was the steady, incremental cost of doing things a certain way, accruing in ways that were not yet dramatic enough to force a reckoning. She understood she was watching the difference between what she was building and what surrounded her, and that the difference was not yet legible to the people living inside it. Garrett Dunmore came to Aldridge General on a morning in late July and bought a box of wrapped beef cuts. He did not make an announcement. He came in when the store was quiet and spoke to Silas privately, and Silas sold him the order at the price Vesper had set. Vesper learned about it from Silas, who mentioned it in the same flat tone he used for all commercial information. Without apparent significance, she wrote it in the notebook, Dunmore. 1 order, July 1885. Then she sat with the entry for a moment before closing the book, because she understood what it represented, even if Dunmore wasn't ready to say so out loud. He came into the store on a Tuesday in August when Vesper was there buying wire. He came in the way a large man comes into a room, filling it somewhat, accustomed to the way a room adjusts around him. He saw her. There was a pause in his movement, not quite hesitation, the pause of a man selecting his approach. He said the beef was good. Just that, standing at the counter with his hat in his hand, looking at the space between them rather than directly at her. The words had been cleaned of everything he'd said at the livestock yard, and that cleanliness was itself a kind of admission, though it named nothing directly. Vesper looked at him for a moment. I'll tell the cattle. She turned back to her wire. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, but the precursor to one stopped before it arrived. He bought what he'd come for and left. Silas, behind the counter, said nothing for a long moment. Then, without looking up from his ledger, that's the first time I've seen that man without a ready answer. The autumn of 1885 brought changes that accumulated rather than arrived in a single moment. The customer list in the back of Vesper's notebook had grown to a length that required its own pages. The boarding house ordered monthly. 2 families from the Methodist Church had become regular customers. A doctor who had come to Brackett's Mill the previous spring, with opinions about the relationship between what people ate and how they felt that the county found eccentric, had walked the pastures in August, asked more technical questions than any other civilian she'd spoken to, and departed with a standing order. The list had also grown to include a name she hadn't expected. A chef had written to her through Silas from a city 3 counties east, the same city she realized when she found the relevant entry in the 6th notebook, where August had once supplied a restaurant whose proprietor had understood what he was raising. The chef's letter gave no indication of knowing this history. He had found his way to Holt Ridge by a different route 30 years later, and arrived at the same door, drawn by the same thing that had drawn the man before him. The existence of something that could not be replicated by any amount of money applied to the wrong methods. She wrote back and named a date for the visit and told him what he could expect in terms of current supply, which was limited. She was not going to promise more than she had. He came in October driving his own buggy, a man of about 40 who looked at the cattle before he looked at the fields, which told her something, and at the field than she'd expected, which told her more. He tasted the beef she'd prepared over the wood stove with nothing that would obscure what it actually was, and he was quiet for a long time. "You can't buy this." He said it not to her specifically, but more as an observation directed at the plate, at the fact of it. You can buy beef, and you can buy expensive beef, and you can buy beef from cattle that were treated well, and you cannot buy this. She told him she could supply him with what the land allowed and no more, and that the land set the pace and she didn't negotiate with it. He said that was exactly what he wanted to hear, and they established an arrangement, and she wrote his name at the bottom of the customer list and went out to do the evening count. It was Tobias, who noticed the change in the southwest pasture before she did. He came to her on a Saturday in November with an expression that was working to be neutral and not quite succeeding, and said he thought something was different in the old lower field, the one she'd rested through both summers. She went with him, and they walked the full perimeter and then the interior, and she crouched down at the spot he'd identified and pushed her fingers into the soil and held what she brought up in her palm. It was the darkest soil she'd seen on the property. Darker than August's middle notebooks had described from the same field 40 years ago. The organic matter was building faster than the records suggested it should, which meant either August's records were conservative or the extended rest had accelerated the recovery beyond his projections. The roots she felt in the upper 6 inches of soil were dense and varied, the kind of root matrix that develops only under diverse plant communities that have been left to establish their own complexity over time. She stayed crouched for a long moment, feeling the soil in her palm, and understood something she hadn't fully understood from the notebooks alone. Understood it physically through what she was holding. The ground remembered because it literally retained the physical structures that made it capable of the things it had been capable of before. The organic matter, the root channels, the water-holding capacity, these were not metaphors. They were the material record of a different history, and they persisted if you stopped destroying them, and they could be rebuilt if you gave them the conditions to rebuild. August hadn't been speaking in figures of speech. He had been stating, in the plainest language available to him, a fact about how the world worked. She let the soil fall back to where it had come from and stood up. Tobias was watching her with the careful attention he brought to everything she did in the field. "Write it down," she told him. She handed him the smaller of the 2 notebooks she carried, the one she'd given him 2 months earlier to begin keeping his own records. "What you saw, what you noticed, what the soil felt like." "Not what I said. What you observed before I got here." He took the notebook, looked at it for a moment, then opened it and began writing. She walked out to go Bieber because the evening count wasn't going to do itself, and because she'd learned to leave Tobias alone with a task he'd been trusted with. In February of 1886, Garrett Dunmore drove out to Holt Ridge. He came on a weekday, which meant he'd arranged his business to allow for it. His wagon came up the red dirt road in mid-morning, and Vesper saw it from the east fence line where she was checking post stability after a stretch of alternating freeze and thaw. She kept working. Making a production of someone's arrival gave the arrival more authority than it necessarily deserved. He walked out to where she was rather than waiting for her to come to him. He stood a few feet away and looked at the herd in the near pasture, at the animals that had descended from the 19-year-old worthless, now looking nothing like the animals at the Brackett's Mill livestock yard on a Tuesday in August 2.5 years ago. He put his hands in his coat pockets. They looked good. 2 words. From Garrett Dunmore, they constituted a concession of considerable scale, and he knew she understood that, and she understood he knew it, and neither of them made anything more of it than the moment required. She asked if he wanted to walk. He said he did. They went through the near pasture and into the rested field, and then along the draw where the spring ran clear even in February. He said almost nothing for the first quarter mile, which she had come to understand was how he processed things he hadn't yet organized into words. He looked at the ground more than at the cattle. He looked at the grass in the rested sections, the density of it, the way the soil held together even in the wettest spots rather than puddling and compacting the way his own fields did. At the far end of the draw, he stopped. He was looking at the spring running quietly in the limestone rocks, clear enough to see the gravel bottom. "I've been putting more feed and more money into my operation every year for 30 years, he said, and there was no invitation to respond in the way he said it, only the flatness of a man making a private accounting public for the first time. Every year the ground gets a little worse. Every year I buy a little more to compensate. I came out here last February expecting to find something I could explain away. I found your south pasture instead." He paused. "What I'm carrying on my best bottomland doesn't match what you're carrying on this hill ground, and I've been in this county longer than you've been alive. The limestone ridge across the draw caught the winter light in a way that made everything look older than it was. Vesper said that most of what she knew came from her grandfather's notebooks, that she'd been reading what he'd left rather than inventing anything. Dunmore looked at her directly for the first time since they'd started walking. I'd like to see those notebooks. She showed him. Not all of them, not in a single sitting. But she brought out the first several volumes that evening and set them on the kitchen table and let him read. He sat with his coat still on, turning pages with a deliberateness that suggested he was reading for use rather than for interest. He stopped at certain passages and reread them. He asked 2 questions, both technical about the rotation intervals August had used in different seasons, and Vesper answered them from memory because she'd read the notebooks enough times that they had become part of the way she thought. He came back the following week with a proposal. He had 40 acres on the northeast corner of his property, eroded land, rocky, producing nothing useful, land whose condition made visible a history of place he'd rather not have documented in the landscape. He wanted to fence it separately and begin resting it, rotating the way the notebooks describe. He wanted to stock it with cattle from Vesper's herd, 4 bred heifers, at whatever price she named, and he wanted her to come and look at it every month and tell him what he was doing wrong. She considered this across the table from him. He was not a man who asked for instruction easily. The asking itself was the significant thing, more significant in some respects than the offer to pay full price. She thought about what August had written near the end of his notebooks, that what a person keeps to themselves dies with them, but what they teach outlives them. She had read that line as principle and had been finding, over 2 years, that it was practical. She gave it a week. Then she sent word, through Silas, that she'd accepted his terms, that she'd assess which 4 heifers suited his ground and his situation, and that they could proceed when she'd made that assessment. The sale happened in March, 4 heifers, full price. She wrote it in the notebook with the standard notation, but she sat with the entry a moment before closing the book because it was the first crack in the wall of what everyone in Irongrass County thought they understood about what she was doing and why. By the summer of 1886, others had started coming. Not many, not in any organized fashion. Irongrass County was not a place where men organized themselves to learn things from a woman in her mid-20s, and the resistance to the idea was structural rather than merely personal. But 3 other ranchers made the drive out to Holt Ridge that summer. All of them older. All of them arriving with the slightly bruised expression of people who have been watching something succeed that they expected to fail, and have had to revise their position privately before they could bring themselves to come ask about it. She walked them through the fields. She showed them the soil at different stages of the rotation. She let them push their own fingers into the ground of the long-rested southwest pasture and feel what 30 months of recovery had built there. She answered questions directly and did not make any of them feel foolish for having doubted, because making them feel foolish would close the door that the walk had opened. One of them, a man named Garfield Pruner, whose operation was on poor ground similar to hers, stayed an extra hour and asked to see the notebooks. He drove home and came back 3 weeks later with his son, who did the daily work on the family's land, and she walked them through again. Tobias Marsh was there for both visits, working alongside her, and she watched him explain things to Pruner's son with a clarity that told her he'd understood not just the practices, but the principles behind them, which was the only understanding that transferred. In August, Emmett Slade paid off his debt for the 2 heifers. He came to the ranch in person to pay it, which wasn't necessary, and he said nothing about what it had taken to put together, because she hadn't asked and he had the dignity not to explain what she hadn't asked about. He said one of the heifers had thrown the best calf he'd raised in 15 years. He looked out at the fields when he said it rather than at her. She wrote in the margin of that entry, because margin ones were where she permitted herself something beyond the factual stock, solid man. That October, sitting at the kitchen table with both notebooks open in front of her, she felt something she could not yet see, the shape of what the next year would require. The summer of 1886 had been dry enough to show the county's structural weakness without collapsing entirely. The numbers at the feed store, the ones the ranchers discussed with the particular casualness of men worried about things they can't control, were not good numbers. The bank was extending credit that previous years would not have required. She read the weather patterns in August notebooks, the years before the drought of 1867. He had observed them the way he observed everything, not predicting, but noting the direction of accumulation. Droughts in that part of Texas didn't arrive without warning. They arrived at the end of a series of increasingly dry seasons that had been trimming the margins all along. The warning signs were visible to anyone reading the right records. She was reading the right records. She made 2 decisions that evening. The first was to accelerate the resting of the north pasture through the coming winter and into the following summer, keeping it entirely ungrazed for a full 18 months regardless of any pressure to use it, because the deeper the root structure she built there, the better the water retention in dry conditions. And water retention in dry conditions was the thing everything else depended on. The second was to use her savings from the beef sales to line the earthen stock tank on the south field with additional clay and stone. August had written that the spring in the deep draw was the permanent water source, but the stock tanks that determined whether you could manage the pasture rotation through a dry stretch or were forced to overstock the fields closest to the permanent water, which was the mistake that destroyed the rotation precisely when it was most needed. She worked both projects through the fall of 1886. Tobias helped with the tank work on Saturdays, following the calculations she was making about water capacity against projected animal days, with the focused attention of someone discovering that a field he'd been walking has more dimensions than he'd seen. By November, the tank was done, and the north pasture gate was latched shut, and the rotation schedule for the coming year was written into a new section of the notebook in the careful hand she'd developed for things she needed to be able to read quickly under any conditions. The last Saturday of November, Tobias stayed past dark mending the gate on the lower draw. When he left, he turned back once at the road. Vesper could see from the porch that he was looking at the fields rather than at her, the way a person looks at something they have begun to feel responsible for. She went inside and built up the fire and opened August's notebooks to the weather records for the winter and spring of 1866, the year before the drought. The entries were sparse, the way his entries got when he was worried. Shorter sentences, more space between observations. He had noted the absence of the usual spring rains. He had noted the condition of the permanent water sources in early summer. And in late summer of 1866, he had written that the draw spring was running lower than he'd seen it in 20 years of watching, and that he'd begun reducing the herd size in response, selling animals he would otherwise have kept, accepting the immediate loss to avoid the worse loss that was coming. He had sold animals he wanted to keep because the land told him to, and he had done it before anyone else in the county understood that the land was telling everyone the same thing. She closed the notebooks and went to bed, because tomorrow was a work day, and work days in Irongrass County started before the light. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar draw below the house, and the ground beneath it held what it had been given, and waited, with the particular patience of things that have outlasted every certainty placed on top of them, for what was coming. The spring of 1887 arrived without its usual announcement. In ordinary years, March in Irongrass County came in with the smell of it, a loosening in the air, quality of light that shifted before the temperature did, the first green showing in the low draws by the middle of the month. Vesper had learned to read this progression and had used it to time the pasture rotations so the cattle the recovering spring grass at the moment of highest nutritional value. March of 1887 came in dry and stayed that way. The temperature rose correctly. The days lengthened correctly. The red-winged blackbirds arrived in the willows along the lower draw the same week they would always arrive, but the soil stayed hard. The sky that should have delivered the slow-soaking rains of early spring delivered nothing, a pale and sourceless light that pressed down rather than opened up, and the grass that should have been pushing green by the third week of March was still the straw-colored remnant of last year's growth. Vesper noted this in the notebook alongside the corresponding pages from August 1866 entries, which she had flagged with a strip of cloth that winter because she understood she would need to find those pages quickly when the time came. The time had apparently come. April brought a week of cloud that produced 2/3 of an inch of rain over 4 days, enough to prevent an emergency, not enough to resolve anything. The grass in the low field greened up in patches, the areas where the root mass was deepest responding first. The north pasture, locked through the entire previous year, showed the most consistent response to the limited moisture. The grass came in lower than usual but uniform, the sign of a root system with enough stored capacity to work with what little it received. She moved the cattle onto the north pasture 2 weeks later than planned, and kept the herd grouped more tightly than the standard rotation allowed, moving them every 4 days instead of every 7. The logic was the same logic August had used in 1866. Put the animals on the grass when the grass is ready, not on a schedule designed for normal conditions. Normal conditions were a convenience, not a constant, and a rotation built only for normal conditions was not a rotation at all. May was worse than April. The clouds that built along the southern horizon in the afternoons through most Mays, building and releasing, the reliable thunderstorm cycle that recharged the shallow water table didn't complete. They built and stalled and dispersed. The sky in the evenings turned colors that had no useful moisture in them. Orange, then a hard pink, then the deep blue of a sky with nothing to give. 2/10 of an inch in May, 1/10 the following week. The drawspring dropped. It did not go dry. The recharge from the deep-rooted sod above it was doing exactly what August had written it would do. But it ran at perhaps 2/3 of its usual volume, and she adjusted the watering schedule accordingly, bringing the cattle to it in smaller groups to reduce bank erosion. In Brackett's Mill, the conversations at Aldridge General shifted in tone without shifting in subject. The subject was always the cattle, the grass, the prices, the rain. But the tone through May and into June developed an edge that hadn't been there before. The particular frequency of men looking at their own plan and finding them thinner than planned, who cannot yet admit this to each other directly and so speak around it in the language of weather and markets. Garrett Dunmore came into the store on a Monday in June when Vesper was there for wire and salt. He looked at her in a way that had none of the residual defensiveness of their earlier encounters, the look of a man who has come to depend on someone's information and is no longer pretending otherwise. "How's your water holding?" She told him the spring was running reduced and the stock tank was managing the difference. She asked about his northeast corner. The expression that crossed his face was not quite relief, but something adjacent. The look of a man discovering that one decision he'd made was holding while others weren't. The rested corner was performing, he said. The soil there was holding moisture better than his main pastures. He'd moved more cattle onto the rested section than he'd planned because the ungrazed land was providing better forage than the fields he'd been working all spring. "Everything I've been grazing the regular way is showing it. Not quietly enough for the room not to notice. The rested ground is the only ground that's handling it." Two of the men at the counter looked over. Vesper paid for her wire and left because the observation didn't need her endorsement to be true. June turned the county brown in sections. The creek that ran through the bottomland dropped to a series of pools, the connecting riffles gone to dry gravel. The root systems in overgrazed fields were shallow, the soil compaction high, the water infiltration minimal. When rain didn't come, there was nothing in the ground to supplement what the sky wasn't providing. The first serious sales started in late June. A rancher named Holcomb on the county's western edge sold 30 head at whatever the market would bear, which was considerably less than a normal year because the market understood what was happening and adjusted accordingly. Two others followed within the week. The livestock yard in Brackett's Mill, which in a normal summer saw its lightest activity, began filling on Tuesdays with animals that had nowhere left to graze, the same kind of animals, in the same kind of condition as the 19 that Vesper had bought in August of 1883 from the same back pen. The sight of it had a quality that she found difficult to write about in the notebook, so she wrote only the facts and kept the feelings separate. She made the first cut in her own herd on a Thursday in late June. It was the decision August had made in the summer of 1866, the one she'd read 3 times and read again. She identified the 6 animals in the current herd whose nutritional requirements were highest relative to their productive value. An older cow whose teeth were going, 2 younger animals whose performance in the limited spring had been the weakest of the group, and 3 others whose position in the rotation made them difficult to manage efficiently under the compressed schedule the drought required. She arranged through Silas to sell them privately rather than through the yard, at a price below a better market but above what desperation would have fetched, because the yard prices in July of 1887 were going to be set by desperation, and she was not operating from desperation. She did not tell herself the decision was easy. August hadn't pretended it was easy either. His notation for that same kind of sale in the 1866 notebook was the only entry in 2 decades of records followed by a blank line. Just the date and the numbers and then nothing. A gap in the text said more than another sentence would have. Tobias came on a Saturday in early July and found her moving the remaining cattle to a new configuration. 3 fields combined into a single large grazing area to give the animals maximum access to the most resilient forage. He looked at the configuration and without being told began rehanging the gate between the middle and east fields. He'd read enough of the notebook by then to understand the logic before it was explained, which was what she had been trying to teach him. They worked through the morning without much conversation, the kind of working relationship that develops when communication has become mostly physical. A direction of movement, a held gait, a second pair of hands on a post that needs to be driven deeper into ground harder than usual. In the afternoon, the temperature reached the highest point of the summer so far, and the sky was the white that isn't cloud cover, but the absence of moisture, a flat, hot blankness pressing down on the limestone hills. Tobias stayed later than his usual hour. As he was leaving, he stopped at the gate to the drive and turned. "My father's thinking about selling his herd." There was no question in it, but the space after it was a question's shape. She looked at him. He was not asking what to do. He was telling her something he needed to have heard out loud. She said his father knew his operation and his ground better than she did, but that if he was going to selling while the animals still had condition was better than waiting until they didn't, and that the market was going to get worse before it got better. Tobias looked at the flagged notebook page she'd left visible on the fence posts. August 1866 handwriting, the sell early entry. He'd read it before. He looked at it again now with the specific attention of someone reading something. For the first time, it has meant something to him personally. Then he left, and she watched the dust of the road settle after he'd gone and went to do the evening count. July was catastrophic. The month produced 3/10 of an inch of rain, all of it in a single afternoon storm that ran off the compacted surface of the overgrazed fields before the soil had a chance to absorb it, turning the dry creek bed briefly into a red surge of runoff, carrying topsoil it would not return. On the rested fields of Holt Ridge, that same storm moved differently. The water, slowed by the dense root structure, filtered into the soil rather than running off, held in the organic matter below the surface the way a sponge holds what a hard floor can only redirect. The drawspring rose briefly after the storm, then settled back to its reduced flow and held there, steady, reliable in the way that things built slowly tend to be reliable. The county turned the color of old straw. Not the gentle gold of a late summer pasture in a normal year, but the particular shade of brown that means the grass is not dormant but dead. The root systems of the overgrazed fields unable to maintain themselves through the extended stress. The bottomland that was supposed to be the most productive ground in Irongrass County showed it worst. The flat, fertile soil that whenever by the valuable that had been worked the hardest had the shallowest root systems, and when the moisture left, it left quickly and completely. People drove out from Brackett's Mill to see Holt Ridge the way you drive out to see something that contradicts what you know to be true. It was not a green island. Green oversimplifies. It was a landscape under stress, the grass shorter than it should have been in July, the cattle grazing a compressed rotation. But it was alive in ways the surrounding landscape had stopped being alive, and the difference was visible from the road. The drawspring ran. The cattle, the descendants of the 19 that Garrett Dunmore had called worthless 4 years ago, grazed through the worst drought in the county's recorded memory and maintained their condition. They were not fat. This was not a season for fat. They were sound, and they were on their feet, and they were doing it without Vesper buying a single bale of purchased hay or a bag of supplemental feed, because the land she had been building for 4 years had enough in it to sustain what she'd been careful never to overask. She wrote in the notebook on the hottest afternoon of the hottest week, July 1887, count intact, pasture holding, drawspring running. She wrote the word green and underlined it once, because the words were still accurate and she had not found a better one. Silas Aldridge sent his son out with a message in the 3rd week of July. Would she come to town on Saturday? Several people wanted to speak with her, and he thought it would be better done at the store than on the road, which was how these conversations had been happening. Sanch stopping her wagon on the way in or out of Brackett's Mill, asking questions she answered as honestly as she could without slowing traffic. She came on Saturday. The store had more people in it than she'd seen there since a winter meeting about water rights 2 years before. Silas had set out additional chairs. The men in the room included Garfield Pruner, whose operation had come through the summer better than his neighbors because he'd been resting a section since her visit the previous year. Emmett Slade, whose 2 heifers had given him a small foundation he was now trying to protect. 2 older ranchers from the south end of the county whose fathers had been neighbors of August's. Garrett Dunmore was there, standing at the back of the room with his hat in his hands. She had not prepared a speech. She didn't believe in speeches for an audience with working knowledge of the subject because speeches simplified things that resisted simplification. She sat in a chair at the front of the room and told them what she knew, which was what August's notebooks had told her. The ground that survived a drought was the ground that had been allowed to build its own reserves. And the process of building those reserves was slow, and the time to begin it was before the drought arrived, not during it. And during the drought itself, the only available strategy was as much of the existing structural investment as possible, which meant reducing stock before the land told you to, not after. She said it in plain terms, without the particular apologetic qualification that she had noticed women in that room would be expected to use, and without the false modesty of pretending she hadn't arrived at these conclusions through 4 years of work. She answered questions directly. When a question assumed a premise she considered wrong, she said so and explained why. 2 of the men adjusted their positions in their chairs. Dunmore at the back didn't move at all. When she was done, the room was quiet, in the way rooms are quiet when they've been given something to process rather than something to argue with. Then Pruner said he wished he'd heard it 3 years earlier, which was the closest he'd come in her experience to saying that he doubted her. And she took it in the spirit it was offered. She drove home in the late afternoon. The road was dusty and the air tasted of drought, and the sky was the orange of a sun, working through too much particulate. She stopped the wagon at the top of the ridge before the road descended to Holt Ridge and looked at the property in the last of the light. It looked like what it was, a piece of land under extraordinary stress that had been given the means to handle it. Not unaffected, not triumphant in any uncomplicated way, but there, surviving the thing it had been built to survive, The cattle were visible in the lower pasture. Cumps was at the front, older now, her coat the rich dark red of an animal that had been well for a long time. 4 years of this specific ground, this specific management, had made her into something that had no equivalent in the livestock yard where she'd begun. Vesper watched her from the ridge and understood with a clarity that required no elaboration that this particular animal was never going to be sold. She had known this from the first week and was still knowing it 4 years later, which was not sentiment so much as the recognition of a thing that had become part of the structure. She drove down. 2 days later, Emmett Slade came to Holt Ridge in the evening, after the work was done, and sat on the step rather than coming inside. The posture of a man about to say something difficult. He had 4 animals he needed to move, not because they were failing, but because the section of his ground where they were grazing was failing, and he couldn't move them to better ground because he didn't have better ground board. And he couldn't afford purchase feed through the rest of the summer. He'd rather loan the animals out than sell them into a market that would punish him for the timing. She looked at the east field, which she had taken out of the rotation in June and had been resting since. The grass there was stressed but present, the root system intact, the water access secured through the tank she'd lined the previous fall. She had left it empty because she understood she might need it for exactly this kind of contingency. She told him she could hold the 4 animals on the condition that he managed them on her terms, her rotation schedule, her movement decisions, her call on when and if to sell any of them if conditions required it. She was not running a hotel for other people's cattle and would not let someone else's animals compromise the system she'd spent 4 years building. He agreed without hesitation, which was the correct response. The animals arrived the following day, 4 cows in reasonable condition, and she put them on the east field and noted their numbers in the notebook. In the 3rd week of July, Garrett Dunmore came to the fence. He came alone, without his foreman, without advance notice, drove up the red dirt road in the early evening and stopped the wagon at the outer fence and got out and stood there, looking at the pasture in the last of the light. Vesper was doing the count in the lower field. She saw him from a distance and finished the count before walking up because the count didn't have a polite pause function. He was looking at the grass, the specific texture of surviving pasture in conditions that had reduced everything around it. His face had the particular quality of a man who has spent a long time being wrong about something important and has recently run out of the resources that allowed him to keep being wrong without paying the price of it. I lost 40 head in July, he said, without preliminary, not ruinous for an operation his size, but significant enough to be said out loud. The northeast corner is holding. Everything I've been running the regular way is not. She waited. Your grandfather was right. He turned toward her now, the last of the orange light catching the side of his face. Not just about the cattle, about everything he was doing out here. And I spent 30 years finding reasons not to look at it. The limestone ridge behind him was going dark. She could hear the drawspring faintly from where they stood, still running, reduced but running, the sound of a thing that had been built over decades to hold through exactly this. She had not needed to be right more loudly than she had been. She had not needed to argue or announce or keep score. The August evening and the brown county and the surviving grass had done all of that on her behalf. And she understood this was exactly what August had been counting on, that the evidence would become its own argument, given time enough to accumulate. He didn't live to see it, she said, the 1867 drought. He sold down before it came and died before it broke, and his ground was the only ground in the county that held, and he never knew it worked. She looked at the surviving pasture. I think about that sometimes. Dunmore was quiet for a long moment. The sound of the spring was the only sound between them. What do I do? He said finally. And it was not the question of a man confirming he'd already decided. It was the question of a man who had taken apart the tools he'd always used and didn't recognize any of the pieces. She told him the truth, that there was no fast version of what she'd been building. The northeast corner he'd rested for a year was a year's worth of recovery. The rest of his ground was starting from zero, and starting from zero meant years of careful management before it would build the reserves that would hold through the next drought. There would be a next drought. The time between now and then was the only time available to prepare for it. She also told him that starting from zero was still starting, which was the only option that led anywhere other than where he currently was. He stayed at the fence until the dark was complete enough that neither of them could see the pasture anymore. When he left, he did not say anything else, just drove back down the red dirt road with the wagon's lantern making a moving point of light until the road curved and the cedar took it. Vesper went inside and built up the cook fire and sat at the kitchen table with both notebooks open. The current one in August's last volume, The Dead Man's Observations Set Against the Living Season. He had written, near the end of the 1866 drought entries, that the hardest thing about knowing something was knowing it alone, not because the loneliness was painful, though it was, but because knowledge that stayed inside a single person was fragile in a way that knowledge shared was not. One death was enough to end it. He had written, "What one person knows, drought can erase. What a community knows, nothing can." She read it 3 times. Then she looked at the list of names she'd accumulated. Dunmore, Pruner, Emmett Slade, the families who had come out to walk the fields. Tobias carrying his own notebook now, and understood that the list was the most important thing in the book, more important than the rainfall records and the rotation schedules, because the list was the thing that would outlast a single season or a single life. Prue Vance sent word through Silas in the second week of August. A folded note in Silas' handwriting, dictated, which was itself a sign of something, because Prue had been writing her own correspondence without assistance for 90 years. The note said she was well but would appreciate a visit. Vesper went the next morning. Prue was in her chair by the window that looked south. A window she'd chosen, Vesper understood now, because it looked in the direction of the Holt Ridge Road. She was 95. The summer had taken something from her that was visible in the way she held herself, not diminished in intelligence or awareness, but concentrated, as though she had reduced herself to the essentials. She looked at Vesper with the same directness she'd always looked at her. The directness more conspicuous now, because it was framed by something thinner. Vesper sat in the chair across the window and told her about the summer without softening any of it, because Prue had never wanted softening, and Vesper had stopped offering it the second time they'd met. Prue listened with her eyes on the south window. When Vesper was done, the old woman said that August had described the drought of 1867 to her in a letter written the following season. A letter she had received after he was already dead, delayed in the mails, and that he had written in it that the ground had done what he'd built it to do, and that he hoped Ruth understood why he'd managed things the way he had, and that if she didn't, he'd left enough notebooks to explain it. Ruth had read the notebooks. Prue had read some of them. Vesper had read all of them twice.
He wrote that letter knowing he was dying?
Prue said, still looking at the window. He wrote it so that someone would read it after the drought and understand what the drought had shown. He didn't know who that someone would be. Vesper said nothing. It was you. Prue turned from the window. Her eyes, still clear, held the particular expression Vesper had seen once before, at the kitchen table the first afternoon when she'd laid the notebook between them. Not surprise, something that had been waiting to be confirmed. He wrote it for you, and you didn't exist yet, and he knew that. The house was quiet in the way of houses in the middle of dry summer days. A stillness that was not peace but suspension, everything waiting for what comes next. Vesper drove home in the midday heat with the county brown on both sides of the road and the dust coming up behind the wagon wheels. She thought about August in the last year of his life, writing observations he could not have expected to survive long enough to matter, writing them anyway, banking on the permanence of paper, the possibility of a reader he couldn't name, in a time he couldn't see, on ground he would not live to watch be vindicated. What she felt, driving through the drought that was proving him right, was something she had no clean word for. Grief was part of it, for a man she'd never met, for the gap between his knowing and his ever seeing the proof of his knowing. Gratitude was part of it, which was a strange thing to feel for someone 30 years dead. What she kept returning to was the word inheritance, not property, not obligation, but this, the specific shape of attention that August had paid to a piece of ground passed through Ruth, through 2 decades of hard seasons and drought years and stubborn record-keeping, to find the one person left who could read what he'd written and put it to use. She stopped the wagon at the top of the ridge before the descent to the farm, the place where she could see the whole of Holt Ridge at once. The cattle were in the lower pasture. The grass was shorter than she'd like, stressed but standing. The drawspring was invisible from here, but she knew it was running, the way you know something you've been watching long enough that it has become part of the structure of your expectations rather than a fact you have to verify. The brown county lay in every direction she could see. The farm at the end of the red dirt road held its specific green. Not triumphant, not theatrical, just alive in the way things are alive when they've been given what they need to be. She drove down. The rains returned in September. The remnant moisture from a Gulf storm coming north, loosening the heat's grip over the course of 5 days of slow soaking rain that the limestone hills absorbed gradually, completely, without waste. Vesper stood on the porch the first evening and listened to it on the roof and felt, without drama, the specific relief of a person who has been holding something at the absolute edge of its capacity and has just been given room to breathe. The drawspring rose 3 inches in 4 days. The stock tank overflowed its spillway on the 3rd day, the water running back down the drainage toward the creek the way she'd designed it to run. Clean and clear, because the fields above it had kept their sod through the worst summer in the county's recorded memory. She let the cattle into the north pasture on the 4th day of rain, the first time that field had seen animals in 18 months, and watched them move through the gate into grass already responding to the moisture. The color shifting at a base from the straw of drought to the faint tentative green of roots that had been waiting with better patience than anything she'd managed herself. She drove to Brackett's Mill the following week and found a county beginning the slow, expensive work of understanding what it had lost. Several operations that had been marginal going into the summer were finished. The numbers spoken at the counter were the numbers of men who had sold everything and were deciding what came next. The livestock yard was quiet in the way it would be quiet for another year, until the herds that had survived were rebuilt, and the land that had been stripped began its slow return to something that could carry cattle again. Silas handed her an order from the chef 3 counties east, prepaid, with a note that asked what supply she could reliably provide through the following year and said, single careful sentence, that what she produced was the only beef he'd served in 20 years of cooking, that tasted like it came from somewhere specific rather than from nowhere in particular. She folded the note into her coat pocket. Emmett Slade's 4 animals came home from the East Field in October in better condition than they'd arrived, and Emmett came with them. She showed him in the notebook what she'd observed about each one through the summer, which had converted the stressed forage most efficiently, which had dropped condition during the worst weeks, and recovered fastest when the rains came. He listened with the careful attention of a man who has decided to take nothing for granted. He paid her for the pasture use without being asked. She'd not set a price, and he had not asked her to, and the amount he offered was fair in the way things are fair when both parties understand the actual value of what passed between them. Garrett Dunmore came to the farm again in October with a proposal written on a single page in his deliberate hand. He wanted to expand the arrangement they'd started with the northeast corner. He had 2 additional sections of the property he wanted to put under rotation management. He wanted to sell the commodity cattle he'd been maintaining at increasing cost for 30 years and restock from her breeding lines when she had animals to spare. He wanted to do it at whatever pace she judged correct. He was not asking her to move faster than the system allowed. He was acknowledging that the system had a pace of its own and that the pace was not his to set. She read the proposal at the kitchen table that evening, with August's first notebook open beside her. He had written in that first winter that the most dangerous moment in building anything slow was the arrival of people who wanted to accelerate it. Because acceleration required borrowing from the future, and the future, in a drought year, was not lending. She wrote back the following day. She told him she would take it field by field, starting with the section showing the most natural recovery potential. The cattle from her herd would follow the land's readiness rather than his schedule. The management practice would need to develop before the animal numbers could grow, and both would develop before the profitability would. And if any of those conditions were unacceptable, she would rather they understood it now. He wrote back in 3 days, agreed to all of it, and added at the bottom, in a different ink, as though written after the letter was set aside and returned to, I should have asked you this 3 years ago. She folded the letter into the back of the notebook. The admission had cost him something he would not have spent 4 years earlier, and she understood the cost. And she understood that accepting it gracefully was part of what the long, patient work of the last 4 years had made possible. Not just the green field and the surviving herd and the accumulating customers, but the space to receive a concession without requiring it to be larger than it was. Tobias Marsh came for his last Saturday of the season. In late October, the post oaks on the ridge gone to their autumn rust. He had been keeping his own notebook for 8 months to see it, and he handed it over with the expression of someone offering something they've built, and she read through it standing at the gate while he waited. The records were thorough and specific and used the notation system she'd developed from August's. But what she noticed most was the voice of it, the way the observations had begun in the first months as careful copies of her methods and had developed over the later pages into something that was his own. Attentive to things she didn't always notice, recording details she might have let pass because she'd seen them before, and he was still seeing them for the first time. 3 entries in the September pages had made observations about the recovery rate of specific grass species after the drought broke that she had not herself written down, because she'd been looking at the overall and he'd been looking at the component pieces. And the component pieces, it turned out, contained information the overall picture missed. She handed it back. Keep going. He took it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a person who needs no more than that and knows it. Then he went back to work. Prue Vance died that winter, on a January night that was cold but not unusually so, in the house at the edge of Brackett's Mill that she had lived in for 30 years and had never made smaller than it needed to be. She died in the chair by the south window. Silas's wife told Vesper when she came to town and found the black cloth on the store door. Silas said Prue had been at the window previous afternoon, looking south, which everyone who heard it understood without being told. Vesper drove out to the cemetery on the hill. On a morning of thin cold light, the county spread below in the gray-green of winter. The grave was beside Ruth's, which was beside August's. 3 people together at last. The 2 who had understood, and the 2 who had been laughed at, though those were the same 2, and the 3rd who had held the memory of both through the long years between. She stood at the graves for a while, feeling the weight of what she would have called inheritance, if that word covered enough of what it was. The grief of people she'd known briefly, the grief of people she'd never known. The strange particular gratitude of having been the recipient of something built by the dead for a reader they couldn't name. That spring, she named a heifer calf from Compass's line, Prue. She wrote it in the notebook beside the date, then sat with the open book a moment longer than the entry required. The work of the morning was waiting, the count, the fence check on the east side, the rotation adjustment she'd been planning since the previous week. She did not stay long, but before she closed the notebook, she wrote below the name, in a line of her own, the first line she had written in either of her notebooks that was not a record or a notation or a decision. The ground remembers. She underlined it once. The way August had underlined the things he meant to stay. The way people underline things they are writing not for themselves, but for whoever comes after. The day she made that entry, there were 140 cattle on Holt Ridge. Descended every one of them from the 19 that Garrett Dunmore had publicly written off on a Tuesday in August 4 years ago. Built on ground that people with more money and more established opinions than Vesper Holt had looked at and decided was not worth the trouble. Fed by the same drawspring that August had noted in his first notebook and that had never gone dry in his lifetime or hers, because the ground above it had been given the conditions to hold what fell on it rather than losing it to runoff and compaction, and the incremental cost of asking more than the land could give. She closed the notebook and walked out to the fence and looked at them in the morning light. Compass moved through the far pasture with the dignified, unhurried pace of an old animal that has been somewhere long enough to know every corner of it. The younger cattle, the 3rd and 4th generation of what August had begun, carried the qualities she'd been selecting for with the patience the selection required. Tobias was visible in the distance, moving the herd correctly, reading the field the way she'd taught him and the way August had taught her through 30 years of patient paper, the knowledge traveling forward through the only medium that had ever been sufficient to carry it. The county had stopped finding anything to laugh about, not because the laughter had been formally withdrawn, not because anyone had made a speech about being wrong. It had stopped because the green field in a brown summer had been a fact, and facts of that specific and unignorable kind have a way of settlections that argument cannot settle, and the questions had been settled. Dunmore was restoring 2 sections of his property. Pruner's son was keeping his own records now, a 3rd notebook in the chain. Emmett Slade had paid his debt and named a cow after Vesper, and was building the kind of herd that would tell the same truth about itself in another drought that this one had told. The truth that the ground had been trying to tell all along to anyone willing to read it. She stood at the fence in the early light. The drawspring was running at full winter volume, its sound carrying up from the draw below. The ground beneath her boots was dark and deep and threaded through with roots, holding what it had been allowed to hold, remembering what it had been given the conditions to remember. The red dirt road ran out from the gate toward Brackett's Mill, and the county ran out on either side of it, and the sky above was the clear, cold blue of a Texas January that has run out of bad intentions. And the morning had the quality that mornings have when the worst is genuinely behind you, and what remains is only the work, which had never been the difficulty. The work had always been the easy part, for people willing to show up before the light and stay until the count was finished and write down what they, with enough precision and say that someone someday would be able to read it and know exactly where to begin.